An old man stands on a ridge of rock at the edge of a valley, and he cannot move his feet forward even one more step. Below him, spread out like a map made of actual earth, is everything he has spent his whole life walking toward. Green hills, a river catching the last light of the day, fields that have never once felt his hand in their soil. He is 120 years old. His eyes have not grown dim, his body has not grown weak, and he is about to die anyway on this mountain, having seen the prize and never once been allowed to hold it. His name is Moses. The mountain is called Nebo, and the land in front of him is the reason this whole story exists. From where he is standing on a clear day, you can see the silver thread of the Jordan River cutting through the valley floor. You can also see the rooftops of a city called Jericho catching the late sun. Somewhere past that lies the flat, pale mirror of a sea so salty nothing can live in it. Moses is not squinting at a vague horizon. He is looking at named places, real coordinates, and an actual landscape. He could probably draw this landscape from memory. He has spent 40 years hearing about it secondhand from every scouting report, every complaint, and every single prayer his people ever prayed about getting there. Here is the detail almost nobody tells you when they teach this part of the Bible. The distance between the mountain where God first met Israel and the border of that valley below Moses is not far. It is not a continent. It is not even a hard journey. Walking at a normal pace, carrying normal supplies, the trip from Mount Horeb to the edge of the Promised Land takes 11 days. Truly, 11 days is a very short amount of time. You could walk it in less time than it takes most people to finish a job application, find an apartment, or plan a wedding. 11 days is nothing. It is like a long weekend that overstayed itself. So here is the question that should bother you. If the walk only takes 11 days, why is Moses still out here 40 years later, watching the sunset from a mountain he is never allowed to come down from on the other side? That gap between 11 days and 40 years is not an accident of geography. That gap is the entire subject of the book called Deuteronomy. Before we go any further, you should know something else about this journey. Somewhere in that wilderness on one particular night, an entire camp of people sat down together and wept, grown men, mothers with children on their hips, elders who had walked out of Egypt with their own eyes, still wet from slavery, all of them weeping together in the dark. You will learn what happened that night. You will learn the date it happened on. And once you know that date, you will never read the rest of Jewish history the same way again. But not yet. We are not there yet. This is not a story about geography. This is not a story about a long walk through sand. This is not a story about a punishment handed down by an angry God who lost his patience. This is a story about what happens in the space between a promise and a possession, the space where most of us are actually living right now, whether we want to admit it or not. So let's go back to where this gap began. This did not start on the mountain, nor did it start at the ending. Let's go back to the moment, 11 days and 40 years split apart from each other, when a generation chose which path it was going to live. It started with 12 men and a question nobody wanted to answer honestly. Israel had reached the edge of Canaan. The land God promised them was right there, close enough to send a scouting party in and have them back within weeks. So Moses chose 12 men, one from each tribe, and sent them in to look at the land before the whole nation crossed over. Walk it, measure it, bring back a report. You can imagine what that mission felt like. 12 men walked into territory that wasn't theirs yet, counting cities, soldiers, and walls. Everything they saw was about to become either a battlefield or a homeland, depending on what they said when they got back. 40 days later they returned, and 10 of the 12 men gave a report soaked in fear. The land is good, they said. The fruit is real. They carried back a single cluster of grapes so large it took 2 men to lift the pole it hung from. But the cities are walled up to the sky. The people there are giants. We are nothing next to them. We can't do this. Their fear did not stop at walls either. They said the land was inhabited by a people called the Anakim. These people were remembered in Israelite memory as being so tall they made grown men feel like children standing next to them. Whether this was literal stature or a larger-than-life reputation, the effect was the same. They didn't just see strong cities. They saw something that felt less like an army and more like a myth standing in their way. And this wasn't the first time Israel had failed to trust God in the wilderness. By this point, God says plainly that the nation has tested him 10 separate times since leaving Egypt. He provided 10 times, and 10 times they doubted anyway, as if every past miracle evaporated when a new problem arose. Water from a rock, bread from the sky, sea split in half with their own feet walking through the middle of it. None of it stuck. Fear has a short memory. Here's what most people miss about that moment. The 10 spies were not lying about the facts. The walls were real. The size of the people was real. What they got wrong wasn't the data. It was the conclusion. They saw a hard problem and decided it was bigger than God. Two men disagreed, Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb from the tribe of Judah. Caleb stood up in front of the entire assembly and boldly declared that the promised land could definitely be taken by them. This was not because the walls were smaller than reported, but because the God who brought them out of Egypt was bigger than any wall ever built. The nation did not listen to Caleb. They listened to their own fear instead. And that night, stay with me, because this is the night we mentioned at the start, the whole camp wept. They did not weep quietly or privately. The text says the entire congregation lifted up their voice and cried out. They cried the way you cry when grief, fear, and rage all show up in the same breath. Parents wept. Children heard their parents weeping and did not understand why, only that something in the future had just gone wrong. This happened before the children were even old enough to walk into it themselves. You can feel the weight of that. An entire generation sat in the dark, grieving a future they had not even lost yet with their own tears. By morning, the grief had turned into something worse. The people started talking about going back to Egypt, back to slavery, back to chains, because chains felt safer than a promise that required walking toward giants. They even talked about stoning Moses and choosing a new leader to march them backward into bondage. This is where it gets remarkable. God did not respond the way you'd expect an offended king to respond. He didn't simply erase the nation and start over, though he had every right to. Instead, he gave them a sentence shaped exactly like their own sin. You spied out the land for 40 days, he said. So you will wander in this wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day you doubted me. Every single person 20 years old and older on that day, the day of the weeping, would die in the wilderness without ever setting foot in Canaan. Every one of them, except 2. The 10 spies who brought back the fearful report didn't even get the full 40 years. Scripture says a plague struck them almost immediately, and they died before anyone else in the camp did. The men who started the panic were the very first ones the panic consumed. Joshua and Caleb were the 2 men who said the walls were real, but God was bigger. Because of their faith, those 2 men would still be alive decades later. As old men by the world's standard, they would walk into the very land the other 10,000 had refused to trust God for. Here is the part nobody tells you when they summarize this story in a single sentence. The 40 years were never about geography. Israel didn't need 40 years to walk a few hundred miles. They needed 40 years because an entire generation had to die out before the nation could carry a new posture into the promise. You cannot carry a slave's fear and a free man's inheritance in the same body. Something has to give way first. The children of that weeping generation grew up under desert skies, eating bread that fell from heaven every morning. They were learning to trust a God who fed them one day at a time. Meanwhile, their parents were dying off, one funeral after another, in a wilderness that stretched 40 years long but remained only 11 days wide. That is the gap and the math sitting underneath the entire book of Deuteronomy. It is the exact math Moses is standing inside of, completely alone, on that mountain ridge we started with. Pause here for a brief second. There is a pattern worth naming before we keep going. A delay is not always a denial. Israel's 40 years were not proof that God had given up on the promise. They proved the promise was still standing exactly where he left it. The promise was waiting for a generation that could finally walk into it without flinching. If you have ever felt like you have been wandering through the same 11 days for 40 years of your own life, you are not alone. You are definitely not forgotten in that either. Hold that thought, because we are going to come back to it. If this kind of close, honest look at Scripture is helping you see the Bible differently, please hit subscribe. Please tell me in the comments which one of these 2 sides you would have stood with that night. Joshua and Caleb, or the other 10. The rest of this story is about to show you exactly what it costs to choose either option. 40 years is a long time to watch people die. Moses spent those 4 decades doing something almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. He buried an entire generation, funeral after funeral, year after year. This happened while the children of the dead grew taller, grew stronger, and grew into the very inheritance their parents had refused to trust God for. Imagine being the one man who remembers every single name. Imagine carrying that weight for 40 years and still getting up the next morning to lead people who weren't even born when the weeping happened. And then the wilderness years started closing in on Moses' own family, too. The nation arrived back at Kadesh, the town at the end of that original 11-day road. It was the same ground where the spies had returned with their report, and where the whole camp had wept in the dark. 40 years later, with almost the entire generation gone, Israel stood again at Kadesh like a wound that had never fully closed. Modern archaeologists generally place ancient Kadesh Barnea at a site called Tel el-Qudirat. This is a desert oasis near the modern border between Israel and Egypt, where a fortress still stands in the sand today. It is not a metaphorical location floating in a vague Bible map illustration. It is an actual patch of ground people can stand on right now. It is the same ground where an entire generation once wept itself out of a promise, and where decades later, a prophetess was lowered into the earth. There Miriam died. She was Moses' older sister, the girl who once hid her baby brother in a basket among the reeds of the Nile. She had watched from a safe distance as Pharaoh's daughter pulled him out of the water. Pharaoh's daughter decided to raise him as her own. Miriam became the prophetess who led Israel in song at the Red Sea. She was present at every major turning point of this entire story from the very beginning. She died at Kadesh, the very town where the 11-day road was supposed to end decades earlier. Pay close attention to these details, because the geography keeps doing this exact same thing throughout Deuteronomy. Names, places, and distances all circle back. Kadesh was not just a random spot on a map. It was the exact door Israel had stood in front of 40 years earlier, the very door they had stubbornly refused to walk through. Now Kadesh was where Moses had to dig a grave for his own sister. Grief has a way of cracking even the strongest men, and right after burying Miriam, Moses cracked. The people were thirsty again and complained bitterly. They made the same complaint, almost word for word, that their parents had made 40 years earlier. God told Moses to do something specific. Speak to the rock in front of the people, and water will come out of it. But Moses, exhausted and grieving 40 years of buried bodies and broken promises, did not speak to the rock. Instead, he raised his staff and struck it twice. He hit it hard enough that you can almost hear the sound. It was the crack of wood against stone, reflecting the frustration of a leader who had given everything and watched none of it land the way he hoped. Water came out anyway, because God is merciful even when we are not. There was a heavy cost for this action. God told Moses, right there at that rock, that because he did not honor him before the people, he would not be the one to bring this nation into the land he spent his life reaching. Read that twice. Consider the man who led the Exodus, the man who stood in front of Pharaoh, and the man who parted a sea with his hands lifted toward heaven. That very man would die outside the land he gave his life for. All of this happened over one single moment of striking a rock instead of speaking to it. This is where the gap gets personal in a way that should stop you. The math of 11 days and 40 years became his sentence too. The leader and the people he led ended up sharing the exact same wilderness and the exact same border they could not cross. However, their reasons for being stuck out there in the desert were not the same reason at all. Soon after, the wilderness took someone else. Aaron, who was Moses' brother and the first high priest of Israel, climbed Mount Horeb alongside Moses and his son Eleazar as the assembly watched closely from down below. On that mountain, Moses stripped Aaron's priestly garments off his body and placed them piece by piece on Eleazar instead. Then Aaron died right there on the mountainside at 123 years old. He had carried the weight of Israel's sin on his own shoulders for decades and never once got to set that weight down inside the Promised Land. These three siblings, Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, had walked out of Egypt. They carried this nation on their backs for 40 years. By the time Israel finally stood ready to cross into Canaan, two of the three were already buried in wilderness sand, and the third was about to join them very soon. Moses does not let Aaron's story go unspoken. Earlier in this farewell sermon, he reminds the new generation of something most never witnessed firsthand. The day their parents melted down gold jewelry at Mount Sinai. They shaped it into a golden calf to worship while Moses was up on the mountain. Aaron, the very brother Moses just buried at Mount Horeb, was surprisingly the one who had shaped that calf with his own hands. Moses tells the story without softening it. He threw the 2 stone tablets down the mountainside and shattered them. Then he lay flat on his face for 40 days and nights, fasting and begging God not to wipe them out. 40 days then, and 40 years later. The number keeps showing up at exactly the moments Israel's faith breaks down. There is one more thing nobody tells you when they teach this story as a simple list of laws and dates. Deuteronomy is not really a legal code being recited by a distant lawgiver. It is the last sermon of a dying man who buried his sister and brother in the same stretch of desert where he is about to bury himself very soon. With whatever strength is left in his old body, he is trying to get a new generation ready to walk home somewhere. He will never get to walk himself. That is the true emotional heartbeat behind every single law in this book. Every command and every reminder here is not mere bureaucracy. It is a loving father, in the last weeks of his life, trying to make sure his children do not repeat the 11 days that turned into 40 long years. Underneath all of these deaths sits the actual center of the sermon Moses is delivering on the plains of Moab. It is not the genealogies, nor is it the long lists of laws about property lines and harvest seasons. Worth knowing first, the Hebrew name for this entire book is not Deuteronomy at all. It is Devarim, meaning words, taken straight from its opening line. It is not a rigid legal code handed down by a distant committee. It is a record of one dying man's actual words to people he loved. The center of those words is a single sentence, repeated daily for thousands of years. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. The word Shema does not just mean to hear a sound. It means to listen in a way that changes what you do next. You can hear an alarm clock and easily ignore it, but you cannot Shema it in that careless manner. True Shema means that the hearing and the obeying happen in the exact same motion. Moses ties that command directly to memory. Throughout this farewell sermon, he tells the new generation to remember their history. They must remember the manna, the wilderness, and what it felt like to be hungry, and then fed by something that fell from the sky every morning with no explanation. Moses tells them that God let them hunger on purpose. This was not to punish them, but to teach them that a person does not live by bread alone. The 40 years were not merely a severe sentence. They were also, somehow at the very same time, a transformative classroom. There is something critical we have not told you yet. Remember the night the whole camp wept? The night that turned 11 days into 40 years? We promised you would learn that specific date, and here it is. According to a tradition preserved in the Babylonian Talmud, written down centuries later by rabbis trying to make sense of recurring historical tragedies, that original night of weeping happened on a very specific day. It was the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Aviv. This seems like just a date on a calendar, except that the exact same date is when the first temple in Jerusalem would later burn to the ground under Babylonian armies. It is also the exact date the Second Temple burned under Roman armies, hundreds of years later. Jewish tradition has treated the 9th of Av as a uniquely marked and tragic date ever since that fateful night. It is a date when something always seems to break. You do not have to agree with every single detail of that tradition to feel its weight. A single night of unbelief in a desert marked the calendar forever. The calendar remembers long after the people are gone. Now watch closely, because this is where the gap finally closes. Before Moses dies, he calls Joshua forward in front of the entire nation to hand over leadership. He does this publicly in the open, where everyone can see it. He does not whisper or slip Joshua a private note. He stands in front of the whole assembly and says two Hebrew words that still get quoted today, chazak ve'amatz. This means to be strong and of good courage. That word chazak does not mean a quick pep talk. It carries the sense of gripping something tightly with your whole hand and refusing to let go even when your arm is shaking. Moses is telling him to hold on to God with both hands when the walls look tall, unlike the 10 spies who let go. Before his final climb, Moses gives the nation one more striking picture that they will never forget. He tells them that when they cross into the land, they are to split into 2 groups. Half will stand on Mount Ebal and half on Mount Gerizim. These 2 mountains face each other across a single dramatic valley. From one mountain, the curses of the covenant will be read aloud, and from the other, the blessings. This creates an entire nation standing inside a choice that the previous wilderness generation failed to make out loud. The pattern of blessings and curses Moses lists matches closely the language used in ancient covenant treaties. Historians have found this exact literary form preserved on clay tablets from the same region and era. Moses is not inventing a strange new genre. He is using the most legally serious document format his audience would recognize, and filling it with the terms of a true relationship with the actual God of the universe. Then Moses turns one more time toward Mount Nebo and climbs it completely alone. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus later wrote about this scene, adding a fascinating detail that the Bible itself leaves quiet. He wrote that a cloud descended on Moses during his final words, causing him to disappear from sight so that no one knew where his body was laid. Whether or not you take every single word of that account as literal history, the picture matches Scripture. It shows a man who walked off the edge of the only story he had, and the ground closed quietly behind him. Scripture tells us that God directly showed Moses the entire promised land. He saw every single region and every tribe's future inheritance spread out beneath him like a map made of actual earth. God told him plainly that this was the promised land, saying he let him see it, but he could not cross. You will not cross into it. Think about what that means for a full minute before moving on. Imagine spending years saving up for a house. You sign every form and hand over a large deposit you can barely afford. The closing date finally arrives, and you stand on the step with the key turned in the lock. Then, for reasons you cannot fully understand or argue against, you are told you can only look through the open front door. You can see every room and every bit of light falling across the floor, but you cannot walk inside. Not you. Someone else gets to live there. That is exactly where Moses is standing at the very end of Deuteronomy. He was not punished into nothing, abandoned, or forgotten. He was just standing at a threshold he was allowed to see but completely forbidden to cross, while someone else carries the historical keys forward. On that mountain at 120 years old, with his eyes clear and strength unbroken, Moses dies. The text says God himself buried him in a valley in Moab, in a grave that no human being has ever found. This is not a story about a man who failed at the very end, nor a God who ran out of patience after 40 years of mercy. This is not about wasted obedience. It is about a man who spent his whole life serving others. He spent his entire life walking other people to the edge of a promise he would only see and never hold. Yet, he kept walking anyway, all the way to the last mountain. That is the conviction under every chapter. Some of you reading this are standing at your own version of Mount Nebo right now. You can see what God has promised you clearly enough to ache, but you still do not have that specific promise in your hands yet. Deuteronomy does not promise that the weight will make perfect sense while you are inside it. It promises something much steadier. The God who buried Moses with his own hands does not abandon people at the threshold. The land was still real and the promise was still kept. It just was not Moses who got to walk into it. Sometimes the gap between promise and possession is simply not closed within your own personal lifetime. That is one of the hardest, most honest things this book has to say to you. Here is the part that should genuinely move you. Chapters after Moses dies, Joshua successfully leads the nation across the Jordan River. They finally set foot inside the land Moses had only been allowed to see. The 11-day walk that took 40 years to finish was completed by a different generation carrying a dead man's blessing in their ears. Chazak ve'ematz means to be strong and of good courage. Moses never said those words to the children directly. Instead, he said them once in front of everyone, to the one man who would actually get to walk them out. Caleb, the other faithful spy who stood up 40 years earlier and said the land could be taken, got to walk it out too. Scripture says he was 85 years old by the time the conquest finally came to pass. Though an old man by any measure, he was still strong enough to ask for the very hill country where the Anakim lived. These were the same giants the other 10 spies used as an excuse to weep through the night. The man who refused to fear giants in his prime stood in front of those same giants' descendants as an old man and asked for their mountain by name. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. We see an old man on a mountain, looking at 11 days of distance that somehow took 40 years to cross. Here is what that gap leaves you with. Takeaway 1. The wait was never really about the actual walk. Israel did not need 40 years to cross a few hundred miles of desert. They needed 40 years to become a different kind of people who could fully carry a promise without flinching at the first wall they saw. If you are in a long wait right now, ask yourself what it might be building in you, not just what it keeps you from. Takeaway 2. Unbelief is expensive, but it is never the end of the story God is writing. 10 men let fear write their future, and an entire generation died holding that fear. But 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, held on to God instead of the wall and eventually walked directly into everything promised to them. They enjoyed what the other 10,000 walked away from. The posture you choose today in your own version of that desert is shaping which side of the story you end up standing on. Now consider takeaway 3. This one should sit with you the longest. Moses gave his whole life to a promise he never personally held. He buried his sister at the door they rejected and buried his brother on a mountain along the way. At the very end, God let him see the land but still told him no. That is not the story of a failed faith. That is the story of a faith that truly mattered, even when it did not get paid out in his own lifetime. Some of the most faithful people who ever lived died standing at a threshold, not inside the house. None of these takeaways are abstract. The people who lived them were buried one at a time in the desert sands. They rest in stretches of desert that still have names today. The God who buried Moses with his own hands is the same God who is quietly present in whatever modern wilderness you are walking through this week. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Where is your own Mount Nebo right now? Where is the place where you can see the promise clearly, but are still standing outside the door? Tell me below. I read everyone. If somebody in your life is in the middle of their own 40 years right now, waiting for something that should have only taken 11 days, please share this. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do for them in a wilderness season is to remind them that the wilderness has an end, even if they do not see it all themselves. Moses never crossed the Jordan River, but the land was still there and the promise was kept. 4 decades after 11 days went wrong, an entire nation finally walked through a door their parents had stood in front of and turned away from in absolute fear. Please do not turn away from your door.